Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our event, International Joint Studio of 2021. Today is the seventh day of our event, and today we will discuss about informal governance. Shortly, we will start our event. However, first, I would like us to give a huge appreciation for Dr. Sri Mariati, Dr. Paul Jones, and Dr. Paulo Silva for arranging and coordinating our Joint Studio event. Today, we will have one lecturer from Dr. Paulo Silva, University of Aveiro, Portugal, which will be moderated by Dr. Adiwan Pahlan Ahritena from ITB. The lecturer session will be started from 5 past 4 p.m. until 5 past 5 p.m. and it will be followed with Q&A session for 30 minutes until 35 past 5. Today, lecturer will be closed with conclusion from our moderator, and the event for today will end at 5:45 p.m. And now, I will explain about the code of conduct in this webinar. First, it is mandatory to use our real name so that the participant can be identified. Participants must understand and follow the procedure during our Q&A session. Participants can ask questions both on Zoom and YouTube platform. If the questions are already asked by another participants, you can do upvote by clicking the like or thumb up icons on that particular questions. The organizing committee has the right to exclude participants who do not follow the rules. And now I will explain the biographical summary of Dr. Adiwan Aritanang. Dr. Adiwan Fahlan Aritanang, he is the head of undergraduate program of urban and regional planning in ITB. He was graduated from undergraduate program of urban and regional planning Institut Teknologi Bandung. He then continued his master degree on Geographic Information Technology, the University of Melbourne. He received his doctoral degree from Bartlett School of Planning, University College London. He was broad experiences in both bureaucracy and academic environments. He also a national committee member of Indonesian Urban and Regional Planning Association. Currently, he is part of Regional and Rural Planning Research Group at SIPPD ITB. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Adiwan. Time is yours.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I am Adiwan, and I will be your moderator for today's speech on informal governance by Dr. Paulo Silva. Before I introduce Dr. Paulo Silva, I would like to inform you a short biographical about Dr. Paulo. He teach at the University of Aveiro, Department of Social, Political, and Territorial Sciences in Portugal. He's also the coordinator for Strategic Design Lab, and his research focus on urban design and policy making versus informality. Also, informal settlements regeneration in Portugal and abroad. Dr. Silva is also a representative of ISOP, Association of European School of Planning in Japan, or the Global Planning Education Associations Network in 2019. Presently, he is also the Japan license to the UN Habitat. In this joint studio, he is also one of the key lecturer of international joint studio with Dr. Sri Mariati and Dr. Paulo Jones. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Paulo Silva for his speech this afternoon. Please, Dr. Silva.
Yep. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And I guess now you can see my presentation. So without further delay, I will start, and I would like to first acknowledge the pleasure and how thankful I am to be here and grateful to participate in this international studio together with my colleagues, and I thank already for them also for their presence in this lecture. I will address the topic that I was invited to discuss here, the one of informal governance. I will add that a concept that is part of the topic of this international studio, self-organization. So I'm going to talk about informal governance in self-organization contexts. The main challenge and the major trigger that I get from this invitation was try to reply to these two topics. How does informal governance contribute to innovative institutional arrangements on one hand? On the other hand, what are the implications that crises have in regard to informal governance? How can these be again a leitmotiv for change and for innovation in these specific times we are now living? I'm talking to a broad audience. I see there's already 103 participants here. And as far as I'm aware, the majority comes from or is doing training in these disciplines of planning, architecture, and design. So I would like to briefly acknowledge the way I'm also an architect, we are trained to do our profession and our job in the future. Most of the time we are trained to deal with objects, to think of cities and of territories in a linear way, and to nourish the idea of standards, and we have very good examples of order, homogeneity, proportion, continuity, given by names that we all know. However, we are not so well trained to deal with heterogeneity, with disorder, with disproportion and discontinuity. And in this regard, informal cities are a great opportunity to discuss those qualities. I would call it qualities that cities also have. So, and me being part of these of this profession, I would like also to share with you 2 or 3 notes on my background. As I started doing, one of my first jobs was dealing with the formalization of informal settlements in architect's office. Later, I designed to start to talk about and to research on emergent patterns. In that time, the emergent patterns of Lisbon metropolitan area were mostly made out of informal settlements and areas that were informally built. And later on, I started to get very familiar with the topic that I said I will address today here, the one of self-organization, but also evolution and co-evolution. So the contents of this lecture will follow this order. I will talk briefly about informality. Most of it maybe you had already, like introduction in past and in the next lectures. So there might be a bit of a repetition, but that's also good for the teaching process and for the learning process. I will talk a little bit about self-organization. Then I will discuss the concept of informal governance, passing to LEBAK SILIWANGI. I have to say that I was lucky enough to be part of the past editions, except last year, which was not a face-to-face one. It was already online, but before. So I had the chance to know LEBAK SILIWANGI for the previous editions. And so I can share still some ideas with you about the territory you are now dealing with. And I will conclude with some thoughts and reflections that can move from here. My challenge was to combine such well, institutional, let's put it this way, concept of informal governance to a lecture that is to a studio that is addressing very physical aspects of informal settlements, such as public spaces, building patterns, etc. But I will reflect on that on the fourth and on the fifth points of my lecture. So very briefly, we know that informal settlements are still taken as something marginal and apart from the mainstream city, from the legal city. I will not go in detail through these 4 topics that the UN established as characteristics for informal settlements. What we know is that they are mainly residential areas in which residents most of the times don't have land tenure, so they don't have land security in terms of owing or having a formal contract to rent the space where they live. Also, they lack basic services in general. They live in risky areas, so there's here multiple facets of risks. There are also usually areas that are exposed to natural and also technological risks, not just to mention these 2, and they can accumulate with that a set of social problems, from criminality to poverty and to marginality in many ways. Together with informal settlements comes also informal jobs, informal economy, and different kinds of informality. Unfortunately, we tend to associate all these informal expressions to negative aspects. And today I'm going to talk to you about one that has a positive one, which is the one of informal governance. And also these ones, they are not all necessarily negative. There are lots of positive aspects on it, which I'm going to try to explain during this lecture. Informal settlements, as we know, are a result of migrations from urban to rural. We can see how the expression of rapid urbanization is associated with informality, but this is not just due to natural demographics, it's also due to the abandonment of rural areas and this caused the emergence of megacities in Africa, in Asia, also in Latin America, but mainly in these regions of the world. The distribution of the informal settlements of these more than 1 billion residents around the world has this order by size, let's say. So first we have the region where we are actually working on, Eastern and Southeastern Asia. After that, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central and Southern Asia, and other regions. I would like to underline that, being myself talking to you presently from the global north, I would like for you to be aware that, for instance, in Europe, still regarding the last reports of the United Nations, there are at least only in the eastern part of Europe 50 million people living in informal settlements. And this has to do with conditions that are associated with informality, that are not just the migrations and the poverty that we're talking about, but for instance, these days are also new phenomena of middle class, for instance, in Africa, in cities that are experiencing a rapid growth in terms of their economy. I know comparatively well the case of Angola, for instance, where middle class people that used to live in the center of Luanda, in the formal city, now are moving to informal settlements because they cannot afford anymore to live in the city centers due to the inflation, due to the economical conditions. So these numbers are good to give a fast portrait from a phenomena like this one, but these numbers hide a great diversity of aspects underneath. Sorry. So I would like to break this idea, first of all, that and that has been most of my research, is to underline the fact that informal settlements are not ghettos. They are part of cities, and they have to be treated as well. And there's no obvious reason to build separate frameworks and separate even studies separating the informal city from the formal city. There is much to learn from comparing the two systems, since they are all part of the urban fabric, and there's a lack of research in this respect. And this happens all over the world in many different regions of the world. And some of these researches, the most recent ones, shows, for instance, that phenomena that occurred already in the global north, like the bulldozer phase that characterized the way informal settlements were demolished in the first half of the 20th century, as Carmen refers to the bulldozer phase. And we thought that we saw that and we would never see that again. But we have colleagues, we have Professor Jones here that already published work in which he shows how this bulldozer phase can come back and can be experimented again and can be part of the agendas of the governments, just not in the same places as before, but in other places, in other regions of the world. In this search for works that show how institutions deal with informality, I together with a colleague of mine and myself, we managed to already research on evidences that, as apparently these are two separate worlds, in extreme cases, they are examples of cooperation and of co-evolution between formal and informal institutions. And here we are starting to approach the topic of this lecture, the one of informal governance. So to wrap up about informal settlements, we can say that they are dynamic, they are complex as well. So they have an evolution and they have a path that is unpredictable, as all the parts of the city in general, as urban systems in general. So there's nothing very different from the urban systems. And there's not a unanimity about one single way of approaching informality. There's many ways to approach this phenomenon in the world. A brief 3 slides about self-organization, just to let you know, and I would prefer maybe to explain these 2 images here. The one on the top shows a set of elements behaving in a quite random way. But what science shows us is that from small interactions between elements, and these elements can be individuals in the case of a human system, you start to have aggregations. We don't stay aleatory like we are here. We all experience this in our first day of classes. We don't know anyone, and there's a more or less a random exploration of the space. But soon we start to aggregate ourselves in our class with a group of colleagues with which we find more affinity, we are more interested, we can start to formulate larger groups, and we can create structures like a students' association, for instance. What is complex on these? What is complex in this very simple example that I just gave is that nothing of these is predictable in the first stage. What happens here in the last stage can be a students' association, can be a cultural, a theater group, can be a A political movement can be many things, we don't know, or can be nothing of these. But nothing is pre-established from the beginning. So there's a non-linear way of evolution in human systems in general, and cities as human systems or urban systems also have this kind of behavior. And we know also that much of this aggregation and behavior and interactions and this way of creating these clusters has to do with the fact that many of these structures have different characteristics. We have more solid and stable structures that are the ones that are on the top of the hierarchy of our systems, like planning institutions, like ITB, like the government of Bandung, etc. And on the other hand, we have lower structures that are more dynamic. They are considered the bottom of the system because of that, because they are very dynamic. They change very quickly, much quicker than the other ones. And this can be the Kampong, this can be the RW government from the LEBAK Siliwangi. This can be shopkeepers in the neighborhood, etc., etc. So, and this combination that can be explained in this very simple way, in fact, can give very complex, can have very complex outcomes. And planning has to deal with that. And we hope that informal governance, for instance, helps to do that. I will just briefly, to explain the self-organization, give you an example of informality in Portugal, so you have some other contact with the informality in other contexts. Just because I'm talking about self-organization and of complexity, I show this sequence on these. I show these maps on this order. Usually, we would start as planners usually are taught to do, and architects, always starting by the broader scale and then go in detail to the smaller scales. I will start the other way around, because self-organization shows us that most of the patterns that we can identify one day in a territory comes from the individual and from the individual interactions. So we have, for instance, here, this is the largest informal settlement in Portugal, which I was lucky enough to work with and research on during my PhD and my master thesis. But this that appears here as a very complex, or this that is an informal, started as an informal area with 450 hectares, is in fact just a dot here in this area. And this pattern of suburban informality is exactly that, is a pattern on the territory of Lisbon metropolitan area. So what happened here in this informal settlement happened all around the peri-urban areas in the south bank of the river, but also in the north bank of the river. The city of Lisbon, the municipality of Lisbon, is here. Where is complexity here and where is non-linearity here? Is that when we look into this metropolitan scheme from 1 decade ago, what this shows us is that there's this, as we all know, metropolitan areas are composed by networks and by poles and by different centralities. Some of these centralities, they are not classified centrality because they are formal and informal. Some of these centralities identified by this regional scheme are, in fact, in the past, they are the past informal settlements, and now they are considered with a huge potential to become the new centralities in the metropolitan area. So this shows how non-linearity is present in the urban development and metropolitan consolidation of a territory like like Lisbon metropolitan area. I will move on with this example to talk about some on informal governance. And before starting with informal governance, I would like just to give a very brief definition of governance to start with. And governance became, as we can read in many definitions of it, as the need of alternatives to the traditional ways of government. And the one that is given as the first example happened in the United States in the 1970s, when planning institutions and transportation institutions could not get together in agreement. And so the government could not perform one single way of developing the territory, because there was different perspectives from these two sides of the development, and new arrangements had to be invented by them. And since they differed from the traditional government, top down, very much orientated to decision and to proposals, there was the need to create a new expression to define as an alternative. This was not anymore government. This was the sharing of decision-making responsibilities between a number of institutions to improve the quality of decision in a more sustainable way, which means a more durable way. And since this was not anymore seen as the traditional government that societies were used to know, this expression was created, the one of governance. Well, this leads us to talk about informal governance. If you look for references to informal governance, you will see that probably 80% of them have to do with international relations between regions of the world. There's lots of literature on how, in such bureaucratic context as the one of European Union, for instance, there's lots of informal governance going on, but there's very little studies on informal governance in terms of the urban contexts, and at the urban level, at the urban scale. I can show you these three quotes here. The ones that, for instance, that Nick Swatini and Paul Jones published in 2016, that says that governance arrangements that provide basic urban services, including the mechanisms applied in managing land, leadership, and the organization of basic urban service provision. This informal governance is not the governance that is recognized and explicitly presented as the institutions. Westminster they refer to unwritten rules, shared expectations and norms that are not enshrined in formally constituted organizations. Ninik and Paul showed in this work how this was much more effective, because it would combine local rules, it would combine, for instance, pre-colonial codes and colonial codes, I have to say, and also the post-colonial codes from Indonesia. Others show that this decision-making, this social governance the informal governance occurs in contexts in which also social relationships can play crucial roles. And the most stunning of the quotes that I have here is one of our colleagues from China that stated this in a scientific paper about infrastructure management in China, stating this: informal governments characteristics have strong predictive power, while formal governance characteristics such as elections do not matter. They were talking about the collection of garbage in systems for the collection of garbage. And for the provision of these services in a specific context, they realized that informal governance characteristics was much stronger than formal governance. And from in this context of putting together and face-to-face formality and informality, I would like to address this very interesting paper on design governance, in which formal and informal tools are compared. And the author, Matthew Carmona, exactly shows in these two schemes that I choose from his paper on the Urban Design Journal, how formal design governance tools are oriented to guidance, to incentive, and to control of the actions, while the informal tools are much more oriented to show evidences, to share knowledge, to promote experiences, and to make evaluation, etc. of the and to assist and to enable, in that sense, new solutions to emerge. So it's more these informal tools are less prescriptive and more used to enable spontaneous or more bottom-up emergence of new tools. He's not claiming that we should replace formal tools of design governance for informal ones. It's just saying that we have to take in consideration these two, and the formal should lead to the informal tools of design governance. I did some very brief, and I wish I could, yes, I managed to take this. Just to give you a brief example how you can trace these in informality. This was a scheme I published some years ago, the same year, 2016, about the formalization of informal settlements in Portugal. And this allowed me to collect a number of information about national events, planning institutions, informal settlements, and then here, self-organization and co-evolution. This scheme shows us that if we look to this process in terms of self-organization, for instance, and regarding informal governance, there's here a moment which we identified as a tipping point of this process, in which external events, and the external event here was very strong. It was a very top-down event, was the entrance of Portugal into the European Union. It stimulated the coordination of the diverse institutions and informal settlements in order to minimize friction between them and to maximize synergies. While this is done, while institutions interact with informal settlements in order to coordinate their actions, in order to minimize friction and to maximize the synergies, at the same time, they are doing something very important for evolution. They are doing a selection, because among a huge amount of informal settlements, there are those that are more available and more qualified to be part of this coordination, and others that are left behind. But this is part of selection, and this is part of evolution. So this is connected with selection and also with pressures, of course. But we cannot see these, and when we talk about informal governance, it's not something that emerges in a moment by decree or by the decision of one single body. Usually it's a long process. In this case, it's a process of 40 years of interactions between informal settlements within themselves, but also of informal settlements with planning institutions. And regarding these informal settlements, I would like to describe these 4 phases that sometimes occur. This is the Portuguese case, but I would like to invite you to reflect on these and think of LEBAK SILIWANGI. And what we have here is from phase 1 to phase 5. We have the start with simply rural land. We have the early settlers. We have the moment that settlers start to organize. The residents are already taking all the space and they're starting to organize, but there's still some separation between them. There are still some random action that are not still totally it's not coordinated. Then when they start to coordinate, they pass to the norming. And then finally, after they norm their actions, they are able to perform. You can ask these, you can ask yourself these whenever informal settlement you are working with. You can ask these when you are working in a kampong like LEBAK SILIWANGI. We are not, I mean, the era of rural land, of the rice fields is gone. The era of the early settlers is gone. The exploration of different patterns of behavior is also gone. And we are definitely in a phase, 2021, in which there are a very good set of norms that are installed. And there are already a very good number of structures that are established in LEBAK SILIWANGI that are performing, that define codes, that regulate the interactions between the residents and and this is very important to have this reflection, because sometimes you can have, for instance, I was already one time aware of a process of informality in which the movement was still between these 2 phases, between forming and storming. They were still exploring alternatives to move on. And they had an invitation of financing from a public institution. And they asked me, what did I think about that? Well, and I showed them this scheme and I asked them, where do you think you are? And they clearly figured out that they were here. Well, I told them, well, if you are there, maybe if you take now financing from a public institution, you are starting to have a kind of an agenda defined by this public institution. So you are not anymore able to consolidate your formation, to consolidate your storming process, because you'll be in a way pushed to suddenly, in a forceful way, to move on, to perform something as a group, and you are probably not ready to do that. So these kind of schemes are useful to describe situations, but then they can also be replicated in other contexts. And of course, this was the first time I noticed the the emergence of informal governance arrangements. It was when, for instance, landowners formed first their associations to deal with their informal settlements. And by doing that, they gained the status and they gained an expression that that was recognized by the government, by the local governments first, not by the central, but by the local governments, by the municipalities. And these allowed them to create a kind of hybrid structures, technical structures, these technical support offices that were a combination in which you had in these offices technical support from the municipalities, but you also had the representatives of landowners associations providing information about which land was from whom, who had the right to do this and this, what was legitimate and what was not legitimate, what was the background of the informal development of the settlement, and so on and so forth. So this is probably one of the most evident examples. This is from the transition between 1974 and 1980, example of informal governance in which that took place in informal settlements in Portugal. What informal governance shows us is that in some cases this can break the monolithic characteristics of planning institutions that we always hear. It's a common sense statement to say that planning institutions are bureaucratic, they are not flexible, they apply rules to control, etc. When we look to this example, we find that, first of all, there's not such thing as planning institutions as such. You have planning institutions at different levels, planning institutions at the central government level and planning institutions at the local government level. And the ones on the central government level were much more into controlling and punishing the informal settlements developments, while the local authorities were much more into cooperating with them. So there's a kind of drift between those institutions, and that showed how malleable even highly bureaucratic structures can be. I'm sure that if you focus in these next days in this kind of issue and you try to talk with the leaders of the RWs and and also with the colleagues from ITB, you will realize that despite we are talking about very respectable and formal and stable institutions, we will find also this malleability. That's why this international studio is happening, because ITB decided to get out of their classrooms where can be comfortably teaching informality inside the classroom, and they went out and they are doing this international studio. So so institutions can be at the same time, they can keep a very stable core that behaves in a very standard way, but then every institutions usually, if they are eager to survive and to evolve, they have a periphery that is exploring, is testing, is experimenting new ways of doing things, new ways of teaching students about informality, new ways of finding solutions for infrastructures, new ways of dealing with informality in general, towards the students, but also towards the communities and towards the government structures. So this actually occurs, and informal governance is very important for this to happen. I will skip these and I will move to the to the case that we have here, just to say that in brief to this topic, that this informal governance has very several benefits for approaching informality. First of all, it's a very problem-solving approach. You have a problem and you tend to find which are the institutions, which are the bodies that can help to solve. Either it's an infrastructure problem or a public security problem. No matter what, it's a very problem-solving approach. The other thing is that it takes very much it pays very much attention to the experiments that are being done, and tends to filter those experiments and to extract from these experiments, from this interaction made on problem solving and on the informal context between different institutions, to institutionalize what actually works. If you see that after 1, 2, 5, 10 years, some procedure work, then you are able to institutionalize that procedure, that behavior, and introduce that into the planning practices, into institutional relations, but also into the benefit of residents, for instance. And also this can become an innovative process. So informality, the most positive way I have to address informality is the one of innovation. It's really a context in which, for the lack of rules, you are able to experiment. You have no choice than experiment alternatives, and by doing that, you end up innovating in many cases. So informal, I see, and I would like to leave here this message: informal governance as an asset to deal with informality. It benefits from self-organized, it can benefit from self-organized arrangements, and can be this lab for experimentation, therefore for innovation. And in these, and I started by naming the designers and architects and planners, we realized that if we look at this way to these informal governance arrangements, we realize that we become we play apparently a very discrete role, but we are in the backstage, and we are the ones that enable all these structures in which we don't take part directly, but we enable all these structures to meet together and to be able to talk with each other, etc. So, and LEBAK SILIWANGI is very much the reflection of this informal governance nowadays. If you look at the main landmarks of the territory, you can see, first of all, how these already blends in a way into the landscape on one hand. On the other hand, how you have, by having the same landmarks you find in other parts of the city, but also the presence of these landmarks has to do with very strong institutions that interact with community, but also interact among them. This happens in a context that it was also explained to you already. This is a typical informal context, the one of the vacant spaces where they represent an opportunity for informality to occur. This happened with what the Dutch plan in 1933 planned for this area. And as this was perceived as an empty space, it was the opportunity for the occupation that you've been working on for the last week. This creates here these different levels. The same way you have these different platforms in the valley from the past rice fields, you also have these different layers of interactions between local leaders, the ITB, the religious groups, etc., structures, etc., etc. And the presence of informal governance is here in infrastructure. When you see different, the combination of different systems, the arrangement adapted with high degree of adaptation to the situation of each area. And the area is just not geographic, it's also the land tenure that it's behind the area. It's also the job tenure of the residents there. It has to do with all these combination of these factors that allow to emerge these different systems on infrastructure, and these are the result of the already occurring informal governance. And the same could be said to the interfaces, to the analysis of the interfaces, and the same could be said to the alleyways that are the main circulation system of this settlement. I would like to underline these, looking at this example, and leave these here. First of all, this fail and this try and fail constant, they are not failures, they are experimentations, and experimentation is a very important ingredient for the emergence of informal governance arrangements. People discussing their daily problems, are interacting, are creating ties, are aggregating themselves, as I showed in the early picture about self-organization, and by that they are creating clusters. Some are more participative, others are less participative, but it's important to identify in each group. That's what I'm doing now in a project that I'm just starting, is to start by mapping which are the most long-living structures, social structures, cultural structures in a specific territory, because already gives us a sign on how people started organizing themselves and clustering among common interests, about common agendas, and subjected to the same pressures, etc. This continuity in time leads to long-term relations, and long-term relations are important for you to identify in the actors in this kampung, but also in another context in which you might be working in the future. It's important to understand how these long-term relations are important, because they establish trust among actors, and trust is very important when in horizontal relations, but also in vertical relations, when you have to communicate between residents associations and different levels of government, for instance. And there's trust when students and teachers from ITB meet residents. They know they are not a threat. They are there to talk to them, to help them, to hear their problems. So, and this is just conquered by long-term relations. And finally, long-term relations are important, but also the third secret, I would say, for informal governance to work is the short chains. Short chains are the ones that avoid the loss of information that can happen much easier in a long chain, in a long bureaucratic chain. So I told you at the beginning that I was going to address physical space, because that's what you are dealing with, and so far I've been talking about institution and relations, and so I prepared this last slide, or almost last slide, to say something about informality and to say something about informal governance. For informal governance to occur, people have to meet, and structures have to emerge, and institutions have to be able to coordinate directions. Meeting spaces are vital for that. They can be closed spaces inside buildings, but they can be also open spaces, as the ones that LEBAK SILIWANGI has, where they celebrate their festivities, but also where they meet in large numbers if necessary. Also, again, when we talk about promoting informal governance and dealing with informal settlements, it's not just about dealing and discussing with informal settlements. People interact when they are discussing that problem, but they will also interact in other contexts if they are allowed to do that. In these contexts are sports, culture, religion, or you can name it. And so again, spaces are needed for that, because there are possibilities there are possibilities for informality to emerge, and informal governance to emerge. So I would like to underline these two aspects from the work you've been doing, and how you can introduce informal governance into these into the work you've been doing in a more practical way, saying we need spaces. We need, despite the space for the local individual for many different uses, we also need spaces for people meet as groups, and people interact as representatives of groups, in order for this informal governance to emerge. I'm sure you agree with me that it will be totally different if, instead of having a community center where we can be received by the community and by the residents, the ITB would host in a meeting room in the campus of ITB a meeting asking the community center structures to go there and to meet. It will be a totally different environment, and it will be, I'm sure the results of this interaction will be totally different from the ones we have, having spaces where to meet inside LEBAK SILIWANGI. Final ideas on informal governance and on the impacts of the global crisis. The time is, we are reaching to the end. Underlining again these three topics, which I'm not going to repeat: experimentation, long-term relation, and short chains are to be mapped and spotted in the work, in the studio work you are doing as an ingredient, probably not the center, the focus of your work, at least for all the groups, but as one of the ingredients of your work. And the impacts of the global crisis. Well, this is probably, we had a financial crisis that was taken as a global crisis 1 decade ago, and I think that was much more a global north crisis than a global crisis. I think this is actually the first time that the global regions, all global regions, are being affected by the same crisis. We are not all in the same boat. We know that circumstances change from country to country, but as a matter of fact, the crisis is global. And what happens, we cannot predict what is the impact that this crisis have in terms of informal governance. What we might dare to say is that usually this kind of crisis help to speed up processes, and usually it can invert even the roles of the different elements of the urban system. All of a sudden, governance, national governance, can become very dynamic on one hand. On the other hand, residents can become paralyzed, and in such a way, with lockdown, this happened a lot. People was forced to stay at home, and in a way this reduced their social activity, so they slowed down their activity. On the other hand, there was much pressure for governments to be more dynamic, to get emergency decisions done, and to get fast solutions to this emergent problem. And given that there was this change can happen between top-down and bottom-up dynamics. Also, what we know is that definitely this is a great moment for experimentation. So in that respect, I'm very positive, because I'm sure there might be things that or changes in this period, some good, but some bad, but others good, that were introduced due to this pandemic, and they will be here to stay. And this is beneficial to have the right to more space than in the past. This is beneficial for people to claim to space as a quality of the environment. It's a very important one. Also, the cherishing of the local urbanism, the local distances between functions is another one. And finally, these global crises are always one of these moments in which they might confirm which are the main actors and allow the emergence of new ones. Who are the old and the new brokers? This is something, the brokers are these elements in social sciences, is the name given to those actors that manage to do the brokerage between, for instance, between residents associations and national and local governance. So I would leave you with these reflections on impacts of global crisis. My time is reaching also to the end, so I'll leave you a list of some references, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Paulo. I think you have give us a very interesting lecture regarding the informal governance. So I would like to continue to our second section, which is question and answer. And we have two questions here. from Aryani Chandramidi. So first is, what do you think about, or who do you think are the enablers and barriers to the emergence of informal governance? And what would be the main difference in structure in the global south as compared with the global north? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ariane, for your questions. Well, the main enablers, I definitely think that the main enablers are the pressures that can, if you have a small informal settlement, it will not be a pressure for a country. So there will be more barriers than enablers to solve that, or to the emergence of that informal governance. But when you have thousands of residents living in informal settlements, that becomes definitely a pressure. So that pressure allows the emergence of informal governance, definitely. And that happened, for instance, in Portugal in the 80s, 30, 40 years ago. 10% of, more than 10% of the population of the Lisbon metropolitan area was living in informal settlements. We are talking of a country within the European Union, and this was happening in Spain equally, and in Italy, etc., etc. So this put great pressure into everyone in order for the emergence of this informal governance. I'm sure that infrastructure situation, water supply in LEBAK SILIWANGI can be very strong pressures, but also enablers. I think ITB is definitely a very strong enabler of informal governance when it comes to the context in which you are working. The barriers, I see pretty much a cultural barrier on this informal governance emergence, because many in many cases there are still this resistance on seeing informal settlements as much part of the city as all the other urban areas. So there's still this dichotomy between city and anti-city, between the formal city and informal city, and this is definitely a barrier to the emergence of informal governance. If we talk in the past, what's happened in the past and what's happening now, I don't think there's much difference between what happened in the global south north in the 4 decades ago and what is happening now in the global south. I don't think there's much difference. I think what is happening is simply the result of the change of our economy. The fact that, I mean, why there was so many slums in Europe at a certain point? Because factories and industrial revolution was in Europe. So concentration and urbanization in and around the cities was very strong because the workforce had to go there. The moment globalization occurred and large companies moved that factories for other parts of the region, of other regions of the world, these moved away the informal settlements from the global north to the global south. Professor Alterman makes a distinction between the global north and the global south in terms of informality. She claims that we can say there is informal settlements in the global south. She says that in the global north, we should not use the expression informal settlements. We should use the expression illegal settlements. And why this difference? Because she says that the proportion of informality in the global south is so overwhelming that we cannot just label it as illegal. It's not illegal. We have to deal with it in another way. It's not a matter of legality. It's a matter of dealing with the situation and try to improve it. On the other hand, in the global north, as these kind of features are so residual, you can actually talk about illegal settlement and not informal settlements. So I would say this is one of the main differences between one or the other. But in the rest, in terms of informal arrangements, informal governance, I see very much similarities between what happens now in the global south and what happened a few decades ago in the global north. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So let's see. Okay, another question is from Tongji Liu Xingqi. Thank you for your presentation, Professor Paulo Silva. What is the difference of informal governance between urban and rural area? Thank you.
The difference of informal governance between one and the other might be much more in the case of rural areas. First of all, the combination, as Ninik and Paul showed in their book on 2016 on informal governance, in which they address informal governance, in which issues have much more to do with, in some rural areas, with the provision of infrastructures on one hand, with dealing with the formalization of property rights and land regulations, while in the informal governance in urban areas usually deal with a diverse level of issues, such as mobility, for instance. Transportation, definitely. These are the ones that put more pressure sometimes in the way, but also the claim for more public space, the claim for solutions to deal with urban density, etc. So I think it's very much to do with the agendas that are defined, because informal governance is not mandatory to occur. It only occurs if there's an agenda for it, if there's a need for it, and there's some pressure to solve some kind of problem on one hand. On the other hand, the level of the structures that interact in these informal governance arrangements tend to be much smaller in the case of rural areas than in the case of urban areas.
Thank you, Paulo. So while we wait for other question, I think I have a question for you. So you said that one of the component is short chain. Now, could you explain in this short chain, where does the government, are they still there, but they are with less role, or they are disappeared at all, or what is the case?
Short chain is mainly about good communication. That's the key role of the short chains. If you have a long bureaucratic chain between, for instance, the informal settlement, the community that lives in an informal settlement, and the national parliament that is going to launch an act or a decree law on the formalization on informal settlements. And if the communication between these two levels has to go through all the bureaucratic levels of the chain, this generates a long chain, and the probability of losing content and distorting content in this communication is much higher. We had some experiences, for instance, that some very successful residents in informal settlements became so much engaged into the formalization process that they would be received in parliament to talk directly to the deputies of the parliament in order to express what was the informal settlements agenda and what was the informal settlements interests. But the other way around, it's also important. When you have something to communicate from top to down, it's also important that you have a broker, you have someone overlapping the long chain, and in order to make it this very quickly the message to get connected with bottom.
Thank you, Paulo, for the answer.
You're welcome.
Perhaps I would like to invite from the panelists. Maybe you have some questions for Paulo also.
I have questions for Dr. Paulo. On your presentation, you ask about the you present about that the crisis in the global north, 2008. Also, the pandemic is sped up the informality process or informal settlements. So, how you compare the speed between the global crisis in 2008 and to the current situation? Which one is faster? Because as we know that the global crisis in 2008 is more about real estate and banking problem, but now is about the health, the health problem that all sectors are affected. So which one is more faster in the process of informality?
In the case of this last crisis, I think that the impact in informality has been much bigger. First of all, because some of these informal areas I'm talking in general, in many cases in the world, but also in the global north, you have lots of migrants living in overpopulated apartments, overpopulated houses, overpopulated neighborhoods. And this created a problem when we talk about social distancing and in order to tackle and to deal with the pandemic. So this made probably the impact of this crisis, this health crisis, to occur faster. The other one was more a slower one that didn't have the strong impact that this nowadays crisis had. So it was a slower crisis that occurred, I would say. So I would say that this current health crisis is much faster and with much stronger impact on informal settlements as well, because people were taken without spaces for themselves, for the need of staying at home, and all at the same time, and with the restrictions regarding the lockdown.
Thank you, Dr. Paulo.
You're welcome. That's why definitely the lack of space is one of the major constraints of this kind of informal areas, because the structure is to reduce and to minimize the empty spaces to the minimum necessary to circulate, to meet in small numbers. When you have a crisis like the one we have, this creates a much bigger challenge in those that are there. They cannot move away, but on the other hand, they don't have that amount of space that they would need to be in good conditions, living in good conditions in these areas.
Okay, thank you. So
You're welcome.
we have another question. Yep. So this one is anonymous. but he or she asks what is the role of informal governance for shaping the innovative space to explore new possibilities.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. Um, it's exactly the fact that when we talk about informal governance, we talk about arrangements that are different from the standards. Sometimes they even not follow the rules that are established in terms of the way an institution should interact with others. And by doing that, they manage to solve some problems, and also by solving some problems in exceptional ways, they manage to see, okay, but this can be a solution not just for this specific case, but this can be replicated in broader contexts, sometimes even in the formal city. And in this sense, we can be innovating in terms of the in terms of the informal governance. I remember a case in which for instance, the bureaucratic, I think this is common to many bureaucratic systems in many countries, in which land registration can be only done if all the landowners are present, for instance, in the notary, in order to sign and to confirm the land ownership of each piece of land. This is easy to do in formal contexts because usually you have a small amount of landowners, sometimes all from the same family. So it's very easy to gather 5 or 10 or 20 people from the same family, go to the notary and sign together the land registration and to divide the land in the same equivalent number of pieces. But when you talk about settlements like the one I showed you, the largest of 450 hectares, in which you have thousands of landowners, the law, it's impossible to apply the law. It's impossible to bring all these people together at the same time, sometimes without even knowing who are they and where do they live, if they still are alive or not, to bring them all together to perform this land registration official action. So what was created by the institutions was an informal arrangement saying, well, in this case, it's so complicated to bring everybody together that we will find an easier way to do this. We will design a plan for the informal settlement. The plan will be approved by the authorities, and then each landowner can go to the notary with a copy of the plan and claim for the land ownership of their own piece of land. And all of a sudden, what was a very complicated system became a very simple one. Well, the moment this was acknowledged, it was realized that, well, why don't we adapt this to the planning system in general? Why don't we simplify the rules and just create this condition? Every landowner just have to have a copy of the plan of the area, bring it to the notary, and not has to go with all the other landowners together. I mean, and this is a case of innovation that emerged from one informal governance arrangement, for instance, that it's explored, it's tested in a very specific and exceptional conditions. Once it's proved to work, it can be replicated in broader contexts. I think this is the simplest example that I can give of how informal governance can contribute for innovation.
Interesting, thank you. So another question from Ariani. Would you say that an alignment of interests, such as common goal and objective, as an important prerequisite for the formation of informal governance? And in times of system shocks, such as flooding in the informal settlement, would this provide opportunity or would this cause disintegration of the governance structure?
The alignment of interests as a common goal is obviously, definitely fundamental for informal governance to occur, because there must be such a common interest around the same. The pressures can be diverse. In the case of the formalization of the informal settlements in Portugal, for instance, there was bottom-up pressures and there was top-down pressures. The bottom-up pressures was the claim for a proper housing conditions. The top-down pressures were from the European Union and had to do with environmental laws and environmental directives. So the pressures don't need to be the same, but they have to converge over the same object. And in this case, they converged over the same object, coming both from top down and both from bottom up. So common pressures are vital, are fulcral for an informal governance. Definitely, yes, definitely, yes. In times of system shock, and this is a good expression, such as flooding or any kind of other catastrophe or crisis, this is a very good opportunity that usually in states of emergency, as we know from these recent times, to put in place new arrangements. And this means that formal governance arrangements can collapse, but also informal governance arrangements can collapse, but others can emerge because the needs and the pressures are others. The floods, you have to attend people very quickly, and you have to find solutions in the short, in the mid, and in the long term to not repeat the same problem. This can create, depending on the impact of flooding, this can create enough pressure to sit together a huge number of different interests and to generate long-term solutions and long-term arrangements in order to solve these problems. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I don't think we have any other questions from the attendees and also from the panelists. So do you mind if we have the speech stop here, Dr. Paulo?
Of course.
Okay, so if I may conclude our discussion for today, the discussion by Dr. Paulo today have showed the importance of no, we have another one before I conclude. So what is your opinion when the stakeholder want to try rearrangement, the informal settlement, but in the same time some residents try to resist the stakeholder?
I imagine that Satrio is imagining a stakeholder that is not a resident on the informal settlement. So yeah, in these arrangements, you might have to, well, in the Portuguese case, what was done is that the stakeholders have they had to vote. There was like democratic processes in order for the decision making to occur. So who had the first, who had the priority in this decision-making process was the resident, and secondly, the landowner. For instance, if the landowner was not the resident, the original landowner, the person that rented or sold the house or the land to the resident, he would have less weight on the decision than the resident. So the priority was the resident, and decision making was taken by majority in general assemblies of all the informal settlers or the residents. So in case that you have a majority of residents that agree in a certain direction, I could say that this is a fair way to move on. If it's only one person trying to, or resisting to all the process among dozens or hundreds, I would say that, I mean, the majority should have the right to decide and move on, despite the fact of one resident that would resist to the stakeholder. But of course, there's always there can be always mechanisms to evaluate these very specific situations. I don't know if you are familiar with the figure of the ombudsman. The ombudsman is someone that is like the voice of the people, let's say, in front of the institutions. In my research, I noticed that sometimes there was cases of people, of residents that were feeling they were treated unfairly by the decisions made by these commissions of residents, and he addressed, or she addressed, the ombudsman, and the ombudsman reported this kind of the voice of this resident to the parliament, and these made changes in the law. So you have always to have mechanisms that allow this to happen. This didn't happen at the first version of the law. It happened only after starting to implement the law. So this is very important to that's why experimentation, it's not finishing, it doesn't finish when you publish a plan or when you publish a law. Experimentation keeps going on when you are implementing a plan, when you are do law enforcement, you are testing the options, and you have to be able to react to the feedback of the residents and of the population in general.
Yeah. Okay, so due to time limitation, thank you, Dr. Paulo, for the lecture for today. So if I may conclude our discussion, the informal governance could be seen as three types. First, there's inhabitants with no security. Second, there's a neighborhood that lacks of basic services. And third is housing that do not comply with planning and building regulations. So we need to see that informal governance as a part of the urban fabric. And through this mindset, we can or planner could contribute to helping the urban poor in the informal settlements with several types of governance, including self-organization and co-evolve. The self-organization itself could be seen as a tool to understand mechanism of informal governance. As such, it needs to highlight three components, which are experimentation, long-term relation, and short chain, to reduce the bureaucracy that is present in the government currently. And finally, we also need to map the informality itself, so we could help the management of this urban governance. I think that is my conclusion from our discussion. So I really appreciate your speech this afternoon. And with that, I would like to thank you, Dr. Paulo Silva, for the speech today. And I would like to return to the MC. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Adiwan. It was a very interesting presentation and knowledge sharing from both presenter and our moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, for tomorrow we will have another great lecturers from Professor Delik Hudala from ITB and Dr. Sylvia Covarino from from German University in Cairo. So don't miss it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. It is a great pleasure to have you all in this evening. We will meet again tomorrow at 4 p.m. Thank you. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Good talk.
Thank you,
Thank
Paulo.
you.
Very
Thank
good.
you very much. Good to see you too.
Yep. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.